The envelope from the past. Sarah Collins wiped the damp soil from her hands onto her well-worn gardening apron. The morning sun streamed through the greenhouse's glass panels, illuminating the rows of vibrant plants she had spent years nurturing. She loved this place. The smell of fresh earth, the quiet rhythm of her work, the satisfaction of creating something beautiful. It was a life she had built from the ground up, one that belonged to her and her son, Oliver. Her phone buzzed on the nearby wooden worktable, flashing another client consultation request. Business was finally picking up. After years of scraping by, struggling to balance being a single mother and running a landscape design firm, things were finally falling into place. At 34, she had learned how to stand on her own without regrets. "Mom, have you seen my blue coding notebook?" Oliver's voice carried from inside their small but cozy craftsman home. "Check your backpack, sweetheart." "The outside pocket," she called back, shaking off the last bits of dirt from her fingers before turning toward the stack of mail that had arrived earlier. It was a mix of the usual: bills, gardening catalogs, advertisements, until she spotted it. A cream-colored envelope, heavier than the others, with gold-embossed lettering that caught the morning light. Her breath hitched as she read the sender's name. Foster Enterprises, Manhattan. Her hands trembled slightly as she turned the envelope over. The last time she had seen that name, it had been attached to something much colder: a lawyer's letter, a denial of responsibility, a refusal to acknowledge the truth. "Got it," Oliver called from the kitchen, his voice snapping her out of her thoughts. Sarah quickly tucked the envelope into her apron pocket, not ready to face whatever it held. Inside, Oliver sat at the kitchen island, already hunched over his laptop, his sandy blonde hair falling over his forehead in a way that made her heart clench. He looked more like his father with every passing year. "Mrs. Rodriguez said we're starting a new project today," he said excitedly. "We're learning about algorithms, and I already have some ideas I want to try." Sarah smiled, ruffling his hair as she moved past him. "Just remember to eat your breakfast too, genius." He grinned but didn't take his eyes off his screen as he spooned eggs into his mouth absent-mindedly. At 12 years old, Oliver already had a mind sharper than most adults. His fascination with coding had started young, and now he was building programs far beyond his years. "What time is coding club today?" she asked, pouring herself a cup of coffee. 4:30. "Can I bike there? Jack and Emma are going too. Text me when you arrive," she reminded him, watching him devour his food. Oliver had inherited more than just his father's sharp intellect, his love for technology, his ability to see patterns where others saw chaos, his intensity when he worked. The irony wasn't lost on her. Sarah turned away, fingers brushing against the heavy envelope in her pocket. She took a deep breath and opened it. The elegant card inside was even more elaborate than she expected. "James Foster and Victoria Kent cordially invite you to their wedding." Her stomach dropped. James Foster, the man she had once loved. The man who had walked away without looking back. The man who had refused to believe that Oliver was his. She stared at the embossed lettering, fingers tightening around the card. Why? Why now? 12 years had passed since that final, brutal conversation when he had accused her of trying to trap him with a baby. He had chosen his career, his ambitions, and his spotless reputation over acknowledging his son. She had chosen to walk away rather than waste years fighting a man who had already decided to erase her from his life. And now, an invitation to his wedding. Sarah exhaled shakily, trying to still the storm rising inside her. James had everything now. He had built his empire. He was marrying a beautiful socialite, a tech journalist whose name was splashed across business magazines alongside his. His world was perfect, untouched by the reality he had ignored. Oliver's laughter from across the room made her chest tighten. Would James ever realize what he had lost? Would he even care? Sarah glanced at the RSVP card. She could ignore it, pretend it never arrived. Or she could go. Not for closure, Not for herself, but for Oliver. Her son had a right to know where he came from. A right to see the man who had given him half of his DNA. And maybe, just maybe, if James saw Oliver in person, he wouldn't be able to deny the truth anymore. Before she could talk herself out of it, she grabbed a pen, checked the acceptance box, and sealed the envelope. Across town, James Foster's office. James Foster stood in his towering corner office, the Manhattan skyline sprawling beneath him. The world he had built, the empire he had constructed with relentless ambition, lay before him in shining glass and steel. On his desk, a list of wedding preparations demanded his attention. Venue contracts, catering details, floral arrangements, all meticulously planned to create a flawless event. His fiancée, Victoria Kent, had been overseeing most of it, but today he was supposed to approve the final guest list. Any red flags? He asked his assistant, Rebecca, without looking up. Nothing significant, she said, hesitating slightly, though there was one name, Sarah Collins. His grip tightened on the stress ball in his hand. She was automatically included through the industry newsletter database, Rebecca continued. I can remove her if you want. James hesitated. The logical part of him said yes. The past was buried. He had moved on. He had no reason to let old ghosts surface now, especially not on the eve of his wedding. Leave it, he said, surprising himself. Rebecca nodded and left, the click of the door behind her leaving him alone with his thoughts. Sarah. He hadn't thought of her in years, or at least that's what he told himself. The memory of her was sharper than he wanted to admit. The way she had challenged him in college, the way she had understood his ideas before he even spoke them. The last time he had seen her, she had been desperate, her voice shaking as she told him she was pregnant. He had walked away that night, convinced she was lying, convinced she was trying to tie him down just as his company was taking off. Now, years later, standing in the heart of the empire he had built, he suddenly wondered, what if he had been wrong? What if the child had been his? The thought had haunted him in quiet moments over the years, but he had always pushed it away. There had never been proof. No lawsuit, no demands for money, just silence. And now she had accepted his invitation. James exhaled slowly, setting the stress ball down. It didn't matter. He was getting married. His life was moving forward. Whatever Sarah wanted, whatever reason she had for coming, they didn't concern him. At least, that's what he told himself. But somewhere deep inside, buried beneath layers of certainty and ambition, a crack had begun to form. And for the first time in 12 years, he wondered what he might find on the other side. A collision course with the past. Sarah adjusted Oliver's collar, smoothing out the navy blue blazer she had bought just for this occasion. It had cost more than she would normally spend, but this wasn't just any event. This was James Foster's wedding, an event that would put them face to face with a past she had spent 12 years trying to protect her son from. She glanced at her reflection in the hotel mirror. The blue silk dress was simple but elegant, her dark hair falling in soft waves past her shoulders. She had debated for days whether or not to wear it, whether to try to blend into the background or stand with confidence. She had chosen confidence. Mom, why do I have to wear this? Oliver fidgeted with the cuffs of his blazer, making a face at his reflection. Sarah knelt to his level, fixing his tie as gently as she could. Because we're attending a very important event, and sometimes we dress up for things like this. Oliver sighed dramatically, but didn't argue further. He was used to her reasoning, even if he didn't always like it. Sarah took a deep breath, trying to settle the nerves that had been gnawing at her stomach since the moment they arrived in the Hamptons. She had rehearsed every possible outcome in her mind, but the truth was, she had no idea how this night would play out. Would James acknowledge them? Would he even recognize his own son? She forced herself to stay composed. This wasn't about James. This was about Oliver, about giving him the opportunity to see where he came from. And maybe, just maybe, making James finally face the truth. The Foster wedding. A world of wealth and perfection. The Foster estate was nothing short of breathtaking. White tents and golden string lights were draped across the manicured lawn. Servers in crisp black uniforms carrying trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres. The air was thick with the scent of roses and freshly cut grass. Sarah felt Oliver's fingers tighten around hers as they walked through the grand entrance. The crowd was a blur of luxury. Business moguls, celebrities, politicians, all gathered to celebrate the union of James Foster and Victoria Kent. She spotted James almost instantly. He was standing near the grand staircase, dressed in a sharp black tuxedo, his posture as controlled as ever. Victoria was by his side, effortlessly beautiful in an off-the-shoulder designer gown, her presence polished and poised. For a moment, Sarah felt like she had been transported back in time, to a life that had never been hers. But then, Oliver tugged at her hand, grounding her in the present. "Mom, look at the cake. It's huge." Sarah smiled at his excitement, but her eyes flickered back to James. He hadn't seen them yet. She wasn't sure if she was relieved or disappointed. She guided Oliver toward their table near the back, away from the main spectacle of the evening. She had no illusions about why they had been invited. It wasn't because James wanted them there. It was a clerical oversight, a mistake that had never been corrected. But that didn't mean she couldn't make the most of it. As Oliver settled into his seat, his eyes already scanning the room, Sarah felt the weight of a familiar gaze. She turned and met James's eyes for the first time in 12 years. The moment of recognition. It was a fraction of a second, a moment stretched impossibly thin. James' expression was unreadable at first, a flicker of confusion, surprise, then something deeper. His gaze shifted from Sarah to Oliver. Sarah saw at the moment the realization struck him. His carefully controlled mask faltered. His breath caught. His eyes widened ever so slightly. And then, just as quickly, he buried it. He turned away. Sarah's stomach twisted. She had expected this. She had prepared for this. And yet, it still hurt. Oliver, oblivious to the exchange, leaned over to whisper, "Do you think I'll get to meet him?" Sarah forced a smile, smoothing a hand over his hair. "We'll see, sweetheart. Let's just enjoy the evening." An unspoken truth. James Foster was unraveling. His entire life, his empire, his reputation, his meticulously planned future had been built on certainty, on control. And yet, one glance at that boy, his boy, had shaken everything. He downed his champagne in one swift motion, his mind racing. The resemblance was undeniable. The sandy blonde hair, the piercing blue eyes, the sharp focus in the way he scanned the room, the way he carried himself. He looks just like me. The realization slammed into him with the force of a hurricane. He turned to Victoria, forcing himself to maintain his composure. "James?" she asked, noticing his distraction. "I need a moment," he said, his voice tight. He walked away before she could press further. His feet carried him toward the terrace, where the ocean breeze did little to calm the storm inside him. 12 years. 12 years of certainty. 12 years of believing he had made the right choice. But had he? Had he really? The boy, Oliver, wasn't just some abstract concept anymore. He wasn't just a possibility. He was real. And James had missed everything. A mother's fury. Sarah found him before he could disappear completely. She stepped onto the terrace, closing the distance between them before he had a chance to walk away. "You saw him," she said, her voice low and sharp. James didn't turn immediately. He gripped the railing, staring out at the waves crashing against the shore. "I saw him," he admitted. His voice was measured, but Sarah could hear the crack beneath it. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. "You know, don't you?" James finally turned to face her. "He's mine." It wasn't a question. Sarah's jaw clenched. Yes. Silence stretched between them, thick with 12 years of unsaid words. James raked a hand through his hair, exhaling harshly. Why didn't you? Why didn't I what? She snapped. Drag you into court. Force you to be a father you never wanted to be. His expression darkened. I never said. You did say, she interrupted, voice trembling with fury. You said I was lying, that I was trying to trap you, that you knew the kind of woman I was. James flinched. She took a step closer, eyes burning. So, no, James, I didn't come after you. I didn't beg you for child support or force you into a custody battle. I raised him. I built a life for him without you, and I did a damn good job. James swallowed hard, his hands curling into fists at his sides. Save it, she cut in. You don't get to be shocked now. You made your choice. She turned on her heel, heading back inside. James stared after her, his heart hammering in his chest. For the first time in his life, he had no idea what to do. He had spent 12 years believing he had left nothing behind. But now he knew the truth. And the truth had a name. Oliver. And he wasn't going away. A truth too big to ignore. James Foster didn't sleep that night. After Sarah had walked away from him on the terrace, the rest of the wedding reception had been a blur. The clinking of champagne glasses, the laughter, the speeches, it all faded into the background, a hollow echo of a world he suddenly didn't belong in. The only thing that stayed sharp in his mind was Oliver. His son, the boy he had spent 12 years pretending didn't exist. Now that James had seen him, really seen him, there was no going back. At 4 a.m, he sat in his penthouse office, staring at the glow of his laptop screen. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, but he wasn't coding. He wasn't working on his next big acquisition or reading financial reports. He was searching. The name Oliver Collins appeared on his screen in article after article. A bright young student, a rising star in local coding competitions, the winner of a regional STEM challenge at age 10. James clicked through the results, his breath catching in his throat. Oliver had his talent, his instincts, his drive. But James had missed all of it. His hands clenched into fists as he scrolled through photos from a past he had ignored. Oliver smiling with his project team. Oliver holding up a trophy, grinning at the camera. Oliver standing beside Sarah, her hand resting on his shoulder, both of them radiating pride. They had built a life without him. James closed his laptop abruptly, the screen going dark. For the first time in years, he had no plan. No strategy, no carefully constructed move. Just the raw, undeniable truth staring him in the face, and he had no idea what to do with it. Meanwhile, in a small hotel room, Sarah lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Oliver was curled up beside her, his breathing slow and even. She had let him stay up later than usual after the wedding reception, eating dessert and watching the waves crash against the shore from their hotel window. He had no idea what had happened between her and James. She wanted to keep it that way. For now, her heart ached as she watched her son sleep, unaware of the storm that had started brewing around him. James knew now. There was no avoiding it anymore. The look on his face when he saw Oliver, it had been more than just shock. There had been something else. Something deeper. Regret. And Sarah didn't know what to do with that. She had spent 12 years building walls around her heart, making peace with the fact that James Foster would never be part of their lives. Now those walls were crumbling. She exhaled slowly, rubbing her hands over her face. She wasn't ready for this. But it wasn't about her. It was about Oliver. And she would do whatever it took to protect him, even if it meant facing James one more time. The first move. The next morning, as Sarah packed their bags for the trip home, her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She already knew who it was. Her fingers hovered over the screen before she finally swiped to answer. Sarah. His voice was quieter than she remembered, less sure. She closed her eyes briefly, steadying herself. What do you want, James? A pause. Then, I need to see him. Sarah's grip tightened around the phone. "No. Sarah, you don't get to demand anything, James," she snapped. "You walked away. You made your choice." "I know," he said. "I know I don't deserve anything. But he's my son. And I need—" His voice broke slightly. Sarah felt something twist inside her. James Foster never showed weakness. And yet, here he was, sounding almost human. She exhaled. "I won't let you hurt him." "I don't want to hurt him," James said. I need to know him. Please." Sarah closed her eyes. She had been bracing for this moment. But she hadn't expected it to feel so heavy. "Let me think about it," she said finally. And then she hung up. A son's questions. Back home, life settled back into its usual routine, at least on the surface. Sarah went back to work at her landscape design business. Oliver returned to school, excited about a new coding project. But something had changed. Oliver was asking more questions. "Mom," he said one night as they ate dinner, "did you know James Foster?" Sarah's heart clenched. "Why do you ask?" Oliver pushed his food around on his plate. "We studied Foster Enterprises in science class today. They were talking about their new AI launch. My teacher said James Foster wrote his first successful program when he was my age." Sarah kept her expression neutral. "That's true." Oliver looked up. "Did you know him in college?" Sarah nodded slowly. "Yes, we were in the same computer science program." Oliver studied her, his sharp blue eyes scanning her face. "But you don't talk about him." Sarah hesitated. "Some people from our past don't always stay in our lives, Oliver." "But why?" He frowned. Did something happen? So many things happened. But she wasn't ready to tell him. Not yet. Sarah reached across the table, squeezing his hand. "What matters is the family we have now." Oliver nodded, but she could see the gears turning in his mind. It was only a matter of time before he started digging for answers, and she didn't know if she was ready for that. The unexpected invitation. A few days later, Sarah received an email that made her heart stop. From Rebecca Chen, Executive Assistant to James Foster. Subject: Invitation to the Foster Enterprises Young Innovators Program. Sarah's hand shook as she read the message. Dear Ms. Collins, given Oliver's demonstrated aptitude for technology and programming, Foster Enterprises would like to extend a personal invitation to our exclusive Young Innovators Program. This 12-week mentorship initiative is designed for exceptional young minds, providing hands-on experience with industry-leading experts. James Foster has personally reviewed Oliver's work and believes he would be an excellent candidate for this opportunity. Please find attached program details and registration forms. Sarah's stomach churned. This wasn't just an invitation. This was James's first move. He was trying to get to Oliver through what he loved most, coding. She slammed her laptop shut, breathing heavily. What are you doing, James? That night, she found herself staring at her phone, debating whether to call him. Instead, she texted Rachel. Sarah, James is trying to pull Oliver into his world. Rachel, are you surprised? Sarah, no, but I don't know what to do. Rachel, maybe he just wants a chance. You always said if he wanted to be in Oliver's life, he'd have to make the effort. Sarah clenched her jaw. Was this effort? Or was it just damage control? She didn't know. And that terrified her. Because if James was serious, if he really wanted to be a part of Oliver's life, everything was about to change. An invitation too big to ignore. Sarah sat at the kitchen table, her laptop open in front of her, staring at the email from Foster Enterprises. It had been sitting in her inbox for 3 days now, untouched, unanswered, like a ticking bomb she didn't know how to disarm. James Foster has personally reviewed Oliver's work and believes he would be an excellent candidate. Her fingers hovered over the trackpad, but she didn't move. James had found his way into their lives again, and this time, he wasn't asking permission. He was offering Oliver a future, a golden opportunity wrapped in the name of a man who had spent 12 years pretending he didn't exist. And that was the problem. Sarah knew Oliver would love the program. He would thrive in an environment surrounded by other young innovators, working alongside some of the brightest minds in the industry. But she also knew what it meant. Accepting this invitation would open a door she wasn't sure she could close. Once Oliver stepped into James Foster's world, there would be no turning back. The sound of a chair scraping across the floor pulled her from her thoughts. "Mom." Oliver stood in the doorway, his sandy blonde hair still damp from his shower, wearing his favorite oversized Coding Club hoodie. His sharp blue eyes flickered to the laptop screen. "Why are you staring at your email like it's trying to attack you?" Sarah let out a soft laugh, but it faded quickly. "It's nothing, sweetheart. Just work stuff." Oliver walked over and peered at the screen before she could close it. His eyes widened. "Foster Enterprises." He looked at her, his voice laced with excitement. "Wait, are they offering me something?" Sarah hesitated, but she knew there was no point in hiding it. Oliver was too smart. She turned the laptop toward him. "It's a program for young coders. A 12-week mentorship. Apparently, someone at the company thought you'd be a good candidate." Oliver's eyes darted across the email, his expression shifting from surprise to pure awe. "This is huge," he breathed. "Foster Enterprises runs one of the best AI labs in the world. Mom, do you know what this means?" Sarah folded her hands together, choosing her words carefully. "It means an opportunity, yes, but it also means getting involved with people we've spent a long time avoiding." Oliver blinked. "What do you mean?" Sarah took a deep breath. She had always been careful with her words when it came to Oliver's father, keeping the truth just vague enough to protect him. But now she could feel the walls she had built over the years starting to crack. "James Foster was in my college program, remember?" she said slowly. Oliver nodded. "Yeah, you told me that." She exhaled. "Well, he's the one who recommended you for this program." Silence. Oliver's fingers tightened around the edge of the table. James Foster. Sarah met his gaze, seeing the wheels turning in his mind. She knew the exact moment when everything clicked. The resemblance, the missing pieces, the questions he had never asked before. He swallowed. "Mom, is he my—" A sharp knock at the front door cut through the moment. Sarah's stomach twisted. She didn't have to guess who it was. Face to face. When Sarah opened the door, James Foster stood on the porch, looking as out of place as a billionaire could in a quiet suburban neighborhood. He wasn't wearing his usual power suit. Instead, he had dressed down, dark jeans, a navy sweater. He looked almost normal. Almost. But nothing about this situation was normal. "Sarah," he said, his voice steady, but she could see the tension in his jaw. "I was hoping we could talk." She exhaled sharply, stepping outside and pulling the door shut behind her. "Are you serious?" she hissed. "You show up at my house unannounced." "After 12 years." James sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I didn't know how else to do this. I sent the invitation, but you never responded." "I was thinking about how to respond," she snapped. "Because this isn't just some business deal, James. This is my son's life." James flinched. "My son, Sarah," he said quietly. She folded her arms. "No, my son. You lost the right to call them that when you walked away." He looked away for a moment, jaw tightening. When he met her eyes again, something had changed. "I was wrong," he said, "about everything. I should have believed you. I should have." He stopped, exhaling sharply. "I don't know what I should have done, but I know what I want to do now." Sarah's heart pounded. "And what's that?" she asked, voice cold. James looked at the closed door behind her. "I'd want to meet him." Sarah's breath caught. "I want to know him, Sarah, not just through articles and competition results. I want to be his father." For a moment, she almost believed him. Almost. But the past 12 years weren't so easily erased. "You don't get to decide that," she said, her voice firm. "Oliver isn't some project you can take on just because you suddenly feel guilty." James exhaled, shaking his head. This isn't about guilt. Then what is it about? She demanded. He met her gaze. Regret. Silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. Then, before Sarah could stop it, the front door creaked open, and Oliver stood there. The moment everything changed. Sarah turned sharply, her breath catching as she saw the look on Oliver's face. Curious, confused, hopeful. James froze. The two of them stared at each other, father and son, for the first time. Sarah saw it immediately. The same sharp blue eyes, the same way they both furrowed their brows when concentrating, the same cautious intensity. James swallowed. Oliver. The boy hesitated. You know my name. James let out a quiet breath. Yeah, I do. Oliver studied him, his mind working faster than Sarah could keep up with. You run Foster Enterprises, he said slowly. You built one of the most advanced AI systems in the world. James nodded. And you recommended me for that program. Another nod. Oliver's fingers clenched around the doorframe. Why? James hesitated. Then, because you're brilliant, he said honestly. Because you remind me of. He stopped himself. Because I should have known you a long time ago. Oliver's breath hitched. Sarah placed a protective hand on his shoulder. You don't have to do this, sweetheart, she whispered. But Oliver didn't pull away. Instead, he looked up at James and asked the one question Sarah had feared most. Are you my dad? James's throat bombed. Yes. Silence. Sarah felt Oliver tense under her hand. She braced herself for anger, for rejection, for something she could understand. But Oliver didn't lash out. Instead, he just stared, processing, calculating. Then, finally, I want to go to the program. Sarah's heart lurched. Oliver. If he's telling the truth, Oliver said carefully, then I should see for myself. He turned back to James. If I go, will you actually be there? James's expression softened. I'll be there every day. Oliver nodded once. Okay. Sarah felt the ground shift beneath her. This wasn't just about a coding program anymore. This was the beginning of something she couldn't control. And she had no idea if it would fix them, or break them even more. A door opened, a past unraveled. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she looked between Oliver and James. The world seemed to shrink around her, the street quiet except for the distant hum of traffic and the wind rustling through the trees. Oliver had made his decision. He wanted to go to the program. He wanted to step into James Foster's world. And James had just promised to be there. She wasn't sure which terrified her more. James exhaled, rubbing his hands together like he wasn't sure what to do with them. I thank you, he said, looking at Oliver. His voice was quiet, careful, as if he were speaking to something fragile. Oliver just nodded, his expression unreadable. Sarah finally found her voice. Oliver, sweetheart, why don't you go inside? I need to talk to Mr. Foster for a moment. Oliver hesitated, glancing between them, before finally nodding. Okay. He gave James one last look, more curiosity than emotion, then turned and stepped back inside, shutting the door softly behind him. The silence that followed felt like a weight pressing down on Sarah's chest. She turned on James immediately. What the hell are you doing? He ran a hand through his hair. Sarah. No, she cut him off, voice sharp. You don't get to waltz in here and throw his world upside down. He's 12. He's spent his entire life without you. You don't get to make promises you can't keep. James met her gaze, something raw in his expression. I'm not going anywhere. Sarah let out a bitter laugh. That's what you say now. But where were you when he took his first steps? When he learned to ride a bike? When he won his first science fair? Where were you when he asked me why he didn't have a dad like the other kids? James flinched like she had struck him. I know, he said hoarsely. I know I don't deserve anything from you. And I know I can't change the past. But Sarah, he's my son, and I can't just walk away now." Sarah's chest tightened. She wanted to believe him. But she had believed in James before, and that had nearly broken her. She folded her arms. "You have no idea how to be a father." "I know," James admitted, his voice heavy. "But I want to learn." Sarah exhaled, shaking her head. "You can't just decide that when it's convenient for you." James hesitated. Then he reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone. "Look," he said, unlocking it and turning the screen toward her. Sarah's breath caught. It was a photo of Oliver. A competition photo, one from when he was 10, holding a trophy with an excited grin, wearing his school's coding club t-shirt. James's thumb hovered over the screen. "I've been watching for years," he admitted, "reading articles, following his competitions, looking at pictures online. I told myself it was just curiosity, that it didn't mean anything." He let out a shaky breath. "But I was lying to myself. I wanted to know him. I just didn't know how to fix what I did." Sarah stared at him, her throat tight. 12 years of pain and anger warred inside her. If he had known, if he had followed Oliver's life from a distance all this time, why hadn't he come sooner? She shook her head. "You don't get points for watching from the sidelines, James. That's not being a father. That's being a ghost." James's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. "I know it," he said again. Sarah rubbed her temples, exhaustion creeping in. "You want to be his father?" she asked, voice weary. "Then you start by showing up, proving you can be consistent, that you're not just here because you feel guilty or because people noticed at your wedding." James's gaze darkened. "This isn't about my reputation, isn't it?" she shot back. "Because it sure looks like you suddenly care now that your name is on the line." His eyes flashed with something unreadable. "Sarah, I swear." "Then prove it," she snapped. James exhaled slowly. "I will." Sarah studied him, searching for cracks in his resolve. But for the first time, she saw something real in his expression, something she hadn't seen in over a decade. Not just regret, not just obligation, but the desperate need to do something right. She swallowed hard. "Fine," she said. "He'll go to the program, but we do this on my terms. No big gestures, no promises you can't keep. You show up, you earn his trust. And if you hurt him—" "I won't," James said firmly. Sarah narrowed her eyes. "If you do, I will never let you near him again." A beat of silence. Then James nodded. "Understood." Sarah let out a slow breath, feeling the ground shift beneath her feet. This was happening. James Foster was stepping into Oliver's life. And she had no idea what it would mean for any of them. The first step. Oliver sat cross-legged on his bed, laptop balanced on his knees, fingers flying over the keyboard. The room was a comfortable mess. Open coding notebooks, wires, a half-empty glass of juice on the desk. Sarah knocked lightly before stepping in. "Hey, genius." Oliver looked up. "Hey, Mom." She hesitated. "Can we talk?" Oliver closed his laptop, tilting his head. "About James Foster." Sarah sat on the edge of his bed, rubbing her hands together. "Yeah." Oliver studied her for a moment before speaking. "Is he really my dad?" Sarah's chest tightened. "Yes." A pause. Oliver nodded slowly, looking down at his hands. "I kind of figured." Sarah blinked. "You figured?" He gave a small shrug. "I mean, we looked the same, and the way he looked at me at the wedding. I don't know. It just made sense." Sarah felt a lump rise in her throat. Her son was too smart for his own good. "Are you mad at me?" she asked softly. Oliver's head snapped up. "What? No. Mom, you're the best. You raised me, and you never lied to me. You just didn't tell me everything. And I get why." Sarah swallowed against the sudden wave of emotion. "I didn't want him to hurt you," she admitted. Oliver was quiet for a long moment. Then he looked at her, his blue eyes steady. "Maybe he already did," he said. "But I want to see for myself." Sarah exhaled shakily. "You're sure?" Oliver nodded. "I need to know who he is. Not just as a CEO, but as a person." Sarah brushed a hand over his hair. "Okay," she whispered. Oliver smiled. "Besides," he said, his voice turning mischievous, "if he's as smart as everyone says, I want to see if he can actually keep up with me." Sarah let out a watery laugh. "Oh, sweetheart," she said, pulling him into a hug. "He has no idea what he's in for." The future begins. James Foster sat in his office at Foster Enterprises, staring at the program's registration confirmation on his screen. Oliver Collins. Accepted. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling. This was it. His first real chance. A door had opened. And now, for the first time in his life, James wasn't thinking about profits or market shares. He was thinking about his son, and the future he still had a chance to be a part of. A bond begins, a legacy questioned. The Foster Enterprises Innovation Center was an architectural marvel. Sleek glass walls, high-tech workspaces, and an energy that buzzed with innovation. It was the kind of place where the future was built every day. And now, Oliver Collins was walking straight into it. Sarah stood beside him in the lobby, watching as he took it all in. His sharp blue eyes darted between the screens displaying AI models and prototype robotics, his fingers itching to take apart every piece of tech he saw. "This place is insane," he murmured, adjusting his backpack strap. Sarah forced a smile, keeping her anxiety in check. "It's definitely something." She had been on high alert ever since they had arrived. This wasn't just another competition or school event. This was James's world, a world she had spent over a decade keeping Oliver away from. And now, she was standing right in the middle of it. "Mom, stop looking like you're ready to fight a robot," Oliver teased. "I'll be fine." Sarah huffed. "I don't like handing you over to strangers." "They're not strangers." He grinned. "They're nerds." Before Sarah could respond, a familiar voice interrupted. "I take it this is Oliver." She turned, and there was James. Dressed in dark slacks and a crisp gray shirt, he stood with his usual air of confidence, but his posture was different. Less rigid, less like the CEO of a billion-dollar empire, and more like a man walking on uncertain ground. Oliver studied him with open curiosity, his head tilting slightly, the same way James did when analyzing something new. James hesitated, then extended a hand. "It's good to meet you, Oliver." Oliver looked at it for a second, then shook it. Sarah held her breath. A handshake, such a simple thing, and yet it was the first real connection between father and son. And it wasn't forced. James turned to Sarah. "Thank you for coming." She nodded stiffly, keeping her expression unreadable. "We'll see if I still feel that way in a few weeks." James gave a small, knowing smile but didn't argue. A woman with short-cropped hair and a sharp, efficient demeanor approached. "Mr. Foster, the students are being assigned their teams." "Right." James turned back to Oliver. "You'll be working with some of the best minds here. I hope you're ready." Oliver's grin was pure confidence. "I was born ready." James chuckled. "I had a feeling." Sarah exhaled. "Good luck, sweetheart." Oliver gave her a quick hug before following the program director into the main workspace. And just like that, he was gone. Sarah turned back to James, her arms folding. "You said you'd be here every day." James nodded. "I will be." Her gaze narrowed. Not just in meetings, not just watching from an office window. His expression was serious now. "I know, Sarah." She searched his face for a sign of hesitation, a crack in his resolve. But for the first time, she didn't find one. And that terrified her more than anything. The first real test. The first few days of the program were electric. Oliver thrived. He was grouped with 4 other prodigies, kids who, like him, lived and breathed technology. Their project, a cutting-edge AI system designed to improve adaptive learning for students with disabilities. It was a challenge unlike anything Oliver had worked on before, and he loved it. But the biggest surprise, James Foster actually showed up. Every day. Not just in passing. Not just for a brief handshake and a speech before disappearing into meetings. He was present. He sat in on brainstorming sessions, asked questions, listened. And while he didn't hover, he made it clear that Oliver's progress mattered to him. And Oliver noticed. "Mom, he's actually kinda cool," Oliver admitted one night over dinner. "I mean, yeah, he's intense, but he gets it." Sarah's fork froze midair. "Gets what?" Oliver shrugged. "How my brain works. How I see problems." His eyes flickered with something Sarah wasn't sure how to name. "It's weird. It's like talking to an older version of myself." Sarah set her fork down. "And how do you feel about that?" Oliver hesitated. Then, "I don't know yet." That was enough to make her heart squeeze. James Foster had always been an impossible presence in their lives, a man who had only existed in whispers and old wounds. But now, he wasn't a ghost anymore. He was real. And Oliver was starting to see that. The breaking point. The illusion of progress cracked 3 weeks in. Sarah got a call in the middle of her workday. "Miss Collins." It was the program director. "There's been an incident." Her blood ran cold. "What happened?" "It's best if you come in." 15 minutes later, she stormed into the Foster Enterprises building, her heart racing. She found Oliver sitting in one of the lounge areas, arms crossed, scowling. James was beside him, his own expression tense. Sarah's eyes darted between them. "What's going on?" James sighed, rubbing his temple. Oliver got into an argument with one of the instructors. Sarah's heart pounded. "What kind of argument?" Oliver huffed. "They told me I couldn't make the AI system open source because it wasn't profitable enough. I said that was stupid because the whole point is to help people, not make money off them." Sarah blinked. "Oh." James sighed, and then he may or may not have told the lead developer that profit-driven models were the reason innovation stagnates. Sarah fought a smile. "Well, he's not wrong." James pinched the bridge of his nose. "No, but calling the lead AI engineer a corporate sellout probably wasn't the best move." Oliver crossed his arms stubbornly. He was a sellout. Sarah pressed her lips together, then turned to James. "And you're mad because—" James let out a breath. "I'm not mad," he admitted. "I'm impressed." Sarah stared at him. "Wait. What?" James turned back to Oliver. "You're right. About open source models. About how tech should be used to solve problems, not just make billions for executives." His voice softened. "And I'm proud of you for standing your ground." Oliver blinked. "You are." James nodded. "But you also have to learn how to fight smart. If you want to change the industry, you have to understand it first. You can't just burn bridges before you even build them." Oliver frowned, considering. "So, what should I have done?" James leaned forward. "You proved them wrong. You build something so good, so undeniable, that they have no choice but to listen." Oliver's eyes lit up. Sarah watched the exchange, something twisting in her chest. James wasn't just present. He was teaching him. And worst of all, Oliver was listening. A future unfolding. Later that night, after Oliver had gone to bed, Sarah sat on her porch, staring at the night sky. James stepped outside, hands in his pockets. "He's brilliant." "I know." Silence stretched between them. James exhaled. "I don't just want to be his mentor, Sarah." His voice was quiet. "I want to be his father." Sarah looked down, fingers tightening around her coffee mug. "Then don't disappear this time." James nodded. "I won't." And for the first time in 12 years, Sarah wanted to believe him. A father's promise, a son's choice. James Foster stood in the observation room at Foster Enterprises, watching through the glass as Oliver worked. It had been nearly 6 weeks since the program began. 6 weeks of showing up every day. 6 weeks of unlearning the distance he had built between himself and the past. 6 weeks of realizing that the boy sitting at the workstation, rapidly typing code and discussing optimization strategies with his team, was more like him than he had ever thought possible. But there was one key difference between them. Oliver wasn't just brilliant. He cared. He had passion, not just for the technology, but for the people it would impact. James had built an empire out of ambition, out of the hunger to be the best. Oliver was building something entirely different, and James wasn't sure if that terrified him or made him prouder than he had ever been. "Mr. Foster," a voice interrupted his thoughts. He turned to see Victoria standing in the doorway, her arms folded. "You've been spending a lot of time here," she noted. James nodded. "I have." She stepped forward, eyeing Oliver through the glass. "He's extraordinary." "I know." Victoria was silent for a long moment before she spoke again. "And what happens when this program is over?" James stiffened, because he didn't know the answer. He had never thought beyond the getting here, beyond the first step of re-entering Oliver's life. But Victoria was right. What happened next? Would Oliver want him to stay? Would Sarah let him? Had he done enough to prove that he deserved to be here? James exhaled, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "I don't know." Victoria studied him. "Are you in this for the long haul?" James looked at her, his expression unreadable. "Yes." Victoria nodded once. "Then you better figure out what that looks like." She turned and left without another word. James turned back to the glass, watching Oliver push back from his chair, stretching before looking over his work. James had spent his life making the biggest decisions with absolute confidence. But this was the most important one of all. And for the first time, he wasn't the one in control. A moment of truth. Sarah knew it was coming. She had seen it in the way Oliver talked about James more and more, the way he lit up when he explained what they had worked on together. She had spent 12 years raising him on her own, protecting him from the pain of a father who had chosen ambition over responsibility. And now suddenly, that father was here, and Oliver was beginning to wonder if he belonged in both worlds. The conversation happened over dinner one night. "Mom." Oliver poked at his mashed potatoes, not meeting her eyes. Sarah set down her fork, bracing herself. "Yeah, sweetheart." He hesitated. "Do you think James is different now?" Sarah's throat tightened. She had spent so many years resenting James, hating the way he had walked away so easily, how he had refused to acknowledge Oliver. But the man she had seen these past few weeks, he was different, and it scared her. Because if Oliver got his hopes up, if James did disappoint him again, she wasn't sure she could protect him from that. "I think," she chose her words carefully, "that people can change. But sometimes it takes time to know if they really have." Oliver finally looked at her. "I want to spend more time with him." Sarah felt her chest tighten. She knew this moment would come. She had just hoped it would take longer. "He's been here 6 weeks, Oliver," she said gently. "That's not the same as being a father." "I know." His voice was quiet but firm. "But I want to see what happens if we try." Sarah swallowed hard, nodding. Because at the end of the day, it wasn't her choice. It was Oliver's, and she had always promised to put his needs first. Even if it broke her heart, the question that changed everything. James sat in his penthouse, staring out over the city skyline. His phone buzzed. A text from Sarah. "Oliver wants to talk to you. Can you meet us tomorrow?" James exhaled sharply, his grip tightening on the phone. The conversation he had been waiting for, the moment he had both hoped for and feared, was finally here. "I'll be there." The decision. The next afternoon, James walked into the small cafe Sarah had chosen, Neutral Ground. Oliver was already there, a half-finished lemonade in front of him, his coding notebook resting beside it. Sarah sat across from him, arms folded, watching carefully. James approached cautiously, taking the empty seat. "Hey," he said. Oliver looked up. "Hey." James hesitated. "Your mom said you wanted to talk." Oliver nodded, shifting in his seat. "Yeah." A pause. Then, "What do you want from me?" James blinked, caught off guard. "What?" Oliver's hands tightened around his glass. "You weren't there before, but now you are. And I don't know if that means you actually want to be my dad, or if you just feel bad because you saw me at your wedding and realized people knew." Sarah tensed beside him, her expression unreadable. James inhaled deeply, leaning forward. "Oliver, I won't lie to you. I made a mistake, a huge one. And I can never change the fact that I wasn't there." Oliver's jaw clenched. "Then why are you here now?" James held his gaze. "Because I want to be. Because I finally stopped lying to myself about what I lost." Oliver stared at him. And then, finally, "What if I let you in and you leave again?" The quiet question hit James like a gut punch. He swallowed hard, leaning forward. "I won't," he said, his voice raw. "I swear to you, Oliver, I will never walk away again." Oliver studied him for a long moment. Then, slowly, he pushed his notebook across the table. James frowned. "What's this?" "My newest project." Oliver sat back. "If you want to be part of my life, you have to earn it." James picked up the notebook, flipping through the neatly written code. A slow, genuine smile tugged at his lips. "All right," he said, "challenge accepted." And for the first time in his life, James Foster realized that he wasn't building something. He was rebuilding something far more important. A family. A bond. A future. Together. Epilogue. A new beginning. The Foster Enterprises Young Innovators showcase was packed with industry leaders, investors, and journalists. And in the front row, Sarah sat between James and Victoria. All three watching this, Oliver took the stage. "My project is about more than just algorithms," Oliver said, his voice strong and confident. "It's about connections, how we build them, how we lose them, and how we fix them." His project, a program that mapped emotional and personal connections alongside genetic ones, displayed behind him. James felt his throat tighten. Oliver had built their story into his work. A story of absence, of regret, of rebuilding. As the audience erupted in applause, Oliver glanced toward the front row, toward James. And for the first time, he smiled. A real smile. A father's promise had been made. And this time, it would be kept.